Hi, everyone. Welcome to our panel. This is Failing Forward. We're going to be talking about how failing is fun, actually, and how to make failing fun and meaningful in your game, whatever game you're playing, and some games that have mechanics to help you do that. I personally love playing to lose. It's my favorite way to play games. You know, don't play to win, play to lose. So I'm Kira. My name is Kira McGran. I am a queer non-binary game designer in Columbus, Ohio. And my two most well-known games are A Cozy Den, which features Leslie snakes making their den as cozy as possible in wintertime. And also Something Is Wrong Here, which is my love letter to David Lynch movies and Twin Peaks. And you can find me on Twitter most of the time talking about that stuff, Nancy. And I'm just going to go around if you can all introduce yourself. I have no pronouns. So just introduce yourself, what you do, and please. John, do you want to go next?
Sure. So I'm John. You can find me on Twitter at Ryamasa, RY0MASA. Somebody who has not been active since 2015 has my name. But that's okay. And I primarily I run games and play games. I actually don't design as much as I used to. I do setting hacks mostly for the most part, as I enjoy setting more than the mechanics. But I also specifically am doing a clinical master's program in creative arts therapy, specifically drama therapy, focusing on the use of LARP and tabletop as therapy interventions. So that's what I do. If you like academic writing for some reason, you weird masochist, not kink shaming, also my kink. But if you look in the pinned tweet of my Twitter, my master's thesis on that specific topic is linked down in the bitty there. So yeah. Other than that, hello, hello.
Great, thanks. Sin, do you want to go next?
Hello, everyone. My name is Synxiec. I am that name in most places, mostly um, Twitter for all of my thoughts on world building and stuff, and on Twitch because games are a thing that I enjoy, especially if they involve like stories, so RPGs and Metroidvanias and all of those other things.
Cool. And Morgan.
Hello, I'm Morgan. I use they, them pronouns. I'm also a game designer. Probably the most well-known thing I've done is a game called The Long Night in the Mech Bay, which you can find in the Racial Justice Itch bundle. And you can find my Twitter at magpie_mirror, where you can see my thoughts as the fourth most famous tabletop magpie.
Awesome.
And that's,
Magpies are great birds.
they are.
Yeah. Um, so cool. So that's all of us. And those of you who are watching, if you're in chat, if you do have questions, keep them in mind as you go. And then if you can, ask them at the end, just so I don't have to scroll through and find them for you. They might get lost otherwise. But please feel free to interact and, I'll try to keep up as we go. Yeah, so with that said, what's failing forward? Let's talk about this thing. Uh, in general, I learned that the term itself, failing forward, may have come from the old game forum, The Forge, which was a place where game designers talked online about various mechanics, design, and game theory. But the concept itself, is broad and moves throughout gaming history in different ways, and I'm sure it happened before and after that as well in several games. Yeah, who wants to start it out? How would you define failing forward? What are the key elements of failing forward? John, do you want to start? You look like you're about to say something.
I'm processing like two sentences that came up simultaneously.
Sorry, I asked
No.
too many questions.
You're super good. I had a bunch of thoughts, they all collided together. So for me, failing forward, the entire idea of it is learning to say that a dice roll, like if we're talking gaming specifically in that context, a dice roll that isn't what the system says is a success does not mean that you've closed that door. Right? Like a lot of people use sort of, when the door closes, like the window opens analogy. That's kind of the thing I think about, is leaving avenues for players to explore what failing something means in a way that is more helpful than you don't do this. Right. And this sort of helps, depending on how abstract or how close the system can be with results of what you're doing. Um, you get things like your bog standard D&D like dice roll if in combat is you swing, you hit, you miss. Okay, that's it. Kind of turns into like a yes no question that everyone does for 3 hours in a row. But that can be that can feel kind of boring, especially if raise your hand if you're that person who sucks at rolling dice. And so if you and if you consistently roll badly, you can really start to feel like you're not playing the game anymore. The game is just continuing on without you, even though you're there. And so my goal in general, especially someone who does it from a therapeutic bend, is to minimalize that feeling while playing games in a way that someone will feel like they're participating even if they are failing.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. The idea of failing as not being like, oh no, I've failed. Now nothing interesting will happen. That interesting things come from failure as well as from success. So that like no matter what the dice outcome is, something interesting happens to move the story forward. Whereas a lot of times I think in how we play games or in our minds, we're thinking, oh, I have to win in order for the game to move forward. Well, you can move forward if you lose too. It's just that there's different outcomes, losing, failing forward. Um, yeah, and I especially like what you said about kind of the traditional just kind of like rolling over and over and over again, as though nothing, you just kind of have to roll until you succeed and nothing else happens. You're just kind of rolling dice. Whereas with the idea of failing forward, you roll once and then you kind of carry that outcome forward. So you don't have to roll over and over again. So even if you fail, like if you roll to open a door, oh, you failed that roll. The door doesn't open, but something else happens. Or the door opens, but you break your hand doing it, or you alert the guard doing it. So different stakes kind of for that roll. Morgan, do you have some more thoughts on the definition of failing forward?
Yeah, I mean, you both covered like a lot of the really important bits, but I think I would just add the real big thing is just the understanding that every single roll pushes the narrative forward in some way, regardless of its success or failure. So you roll, you fail or you don't hit whatever the dice number you're supposed to get. Things are still happening. Things are still like going, like moving, and those things should be interesting for you, at least to the players, even if the characters are suffering in the moment.
Right, exactly. Like it might be fun for you to play some bad happening to your character. Although it is bad for your character, you might want that to happen, that bad thing to happen to your character, because it creates complication for your character, right? Or maybe you want your character to feel sad or go through something difficult.
Or even really simply, it's just failing to create adversity for your character. It's fun then when you overcome that adversity, right?
Absolutely.
And so like a lot of like failure can be just creating interesting things in the narrative to add for your characters to deal with. And that's a lot of, I think, one of the big parts of failing forward.
Yeah, and I think importantly there is the player having the agency to make the decision to create that complication, because the dice allowed them to, it's a conversation then between the player and the GM as to what might happen next, as opposed to the dice constantly rolling to tell you what will happen. It becomes a story decision, and instead of just like a constantly rolling dice decision.
Yeah.
I think adding to what Morgan just said, it's also a thing where for me, failing is also meaningful. In some cases, that failure means I didn't necessarily even plan for this to be here, but now that it's here, I have options to deal with other than, well, That opportunity is just gone. Now I have to like go to a different town or talk to a different NPC because we got into a fight in this particular tavern. But more like, so I am in this, just for example, hey, I'm a paladin. I wanted to protect something and I didn't get to. Now I have to reconcile that with, hey, this is the thing that I set out to do. What does this mean? Does this mean that I just kind of abandon everything that I've learned? Do I see this as, I guess this is the part where I learn if this is a real thing or not, type of thing. And wow, that took me places because there's a very particular like experience I had with that still to this day is just kind of like, this is why failing forward is important rather than just things being like, well, you didn't do that, or you tried to be sneaky and you got caught and now you're in jail and people are mad at you. But it's kind of like, well, okay, so there are consequences, but as a player, I don't care about them. My character is just going to sit in jail for 3 days and be perfectly healthy when they get out, but I don't have anything to do with that, you know? Versus being able to go, you know something, DM, I might have to think about what my character wants to do now that I have this bit of information.
Totally. Yeah, yeah. Oh, I'm sorry. Were you going to say something else?
Oh, no, just processing stuff.
Oh, okay. No, and I think what you brought up as far as like there's kind of like a type of consent at play here with failing forward, where it's kind of like a contract between the GM and the players that if you fail, something interesting is going to happen instead of if you fail, there's going to be unforeseen consequences that might be difficult kind of on a meta level of play where your interaction with the combat might stop for 20 rounds, giving you nothing to do maybe for 2 hours because you failed a roll. Or you might have to make a character decision that you aren't happy with because you failed something, and without having a conversation with the GM about that, it kind of takes away some of your player agency on like a meta level. So if you have the idea of failing forward, no matter what game you're playing, I mean, you can kind of like overlay these concepts onto any game that doesn't necessarily have it in the mechanics. It's kind of like a contract and a conversation among the players and the GM that if failed rolls happen, something interesting and fun is going to happen. It won't stop play, it won't stop narrative, and it won't take away player agency. So yeah, you were thinking of a specific example, actually, Sin, which leads into our next question.
I was.
Do you remember that example that, of what happened to your character?
Oh, yeah, a bit too well. Rio, sorry. Well, I was going to call him Rio, but it's John. Hi, your name's right there. But,
either ways works. It's cool. That's fine.
Was it in your game together?
No, I think we talked about it on an earlier panel.
Oh,
it was
gotcha.
something. It was the thing that we were talking about earlier, where I had my paladin gotten to a confrontation because, as paladins do, they draw attention and someone set an assassin after them, and it's like my character is very much I will throw hands if I have to, but I won't like murder people if I can avoid it, right? So he's just kind of like, all right, we're going to find out why you were here, and then we're going to send you home and, no more doing bad things. So they go out, and other of the party members were just like, we're just going to have a talk. And I'm just like, listen, don't make me have to come in there for you, right? Just ask them the questions that we need to ask and send them home. So that was what we had agreed. And the next session came in and we introduced a new player to the game. So during that time, shortly after the questioning, the new player comes in and they come in brandishing a trident for this person that I had promised just like a little bit ago to protect, even though they tried to assassinate me. So needless to say, the dice and the way they rolled meant I did not get to protect this person. And it left me in a real like somber mood, both in character and as a player. So as I'm leaving, I'm like carrying this person and trying to bury them in a place that's the Arctic, but it's like permafrozen. So I can't bury them without like tools, and no one has those because it's like 2 a.m. So that was a whole thing. And this is where my character is just like, I came all the way out here, and his big thing is trying to do the things that he says he's going to do. And he went to go protect this person, and he failed at doing so. And so it was first, I'm going to need a day or two to recover from this. And then it was, well, what does this mean? And so rather than it just being like, well, that person's just gone now, the DM and I ended up having a whole moment where he got to, he went into his meditations and just aired his grief about that whole situation. And it was this really cool cinematic moment where the god that he serves is a giant bear. And they responded, and he got to learn things about who he is and what he's supposed to be doing in the world. And that is like far more interesting than just, well, we're sad that this person's gone now and I couldn't do anything about it. Oh, well, and just, being kind of, we're going to be sad about it for a couple of days, but then just continue with things. It changed like the whole course of what this character does and how he relates to people. And the person who came in and originally did the thing also got to have a moment of, maybe I should learn to handle situations other than immediately at the point of a blade first. So it was kind of cool. Everybody kind of developed together because of it. And that still like resonates with me like emotionally in a good way, like several months after the whole thing happened. So Failing Forward is a pretty spiffy thing when you do it.
Yeah, that's cool. And it's almost like a domino effect of narrative consequences, right? Like at that moment, you've done the mechanical thing, you've rolled the dice, and then you did whatever the dice told you to do. But then afterwards, it was kind of a conversation about what to do next. Like, how do we frame that failure in the narrative within the character's interests that will move them into something that is relevant and interesting to the story and to them. So yeah, I feel like I'm cheating a little bit with this question with examples, because I GM a lot of Powered by the Apocalypse games. Is probably like my favorite system, because I think it makes GMing super easy, super easy, barely an inconvenience. So yeah,
got into one of those games, and the first 2 sessions scared me in that system. We'll talk about that later.
It's really funny because I think I've just been playing them for too long, like maybe 10 years now. And before that, I played mostly story-driven games like, Vampire, as opposed to coming maybe from a D&D background, which is still story-driven, but, whatever. And, Powered by the Apocalypse now has like many offshoots. Like it's also like Blades in the Dark. It's also Dream Askew, Dream Apart. And I think that throughout all of these games, like there's like the idea of success with a cost, the 7 to 9 result, and then the failure, which is basically becomes the GM move. So like whenever characters roll a fail, the GM then decides kind of what happens in the narrative. And my favorite thing to do as a GM in those situations to help fail forward is when a failure occurs, they pretty much do the thing they were trying to do, but then something infinitely worse happens that then is kind of related to their character or the story that they're kind of working towards, right? So it's hard to think of a direct example like in a story for this, but kind of basically the failure has less to do with like opening the door or succeeding at talking to someone convincingly, that they do that, but then the next thing happens that's unrelated. A storm appears on the horizon, or a monster crawls out of the darkness. and those things make the failure more about the story than the actual thing that was happening. So I don't know, yeah, John or Morgan, do you have like kind of more examples of this in play? that you can think of directly? If not, we can move on.
Yeah, I mean, I can think of a few. Fortunately, I talked about one of these on another panel, so I remember. But let's do a new one. So since we're talking about PBTA, I jam a lot of masks. Because masks great. But yes. And so one time I was running a game. There was a character who was basically just protege to this other well-known hero in the city, and it's just at some point they like got into this whole situation where they basically go into the equivalent of like the Speed Force and the Flash, but it's just this dimension of lots of like speed energy and where super speed comes from, and they're just trying to prevent a villain from escaping, and like that's their goal here. And at one point, basically, just a giant shockwave comes flying through, trying to rip open a hole into the normal world, and the goal that the character said is like, I want to prevent this, like I want to stop this from like opening the rift. Rolls a miss, which is the PBTA version of a failure. And so we could have possibly just had the failure be, oh, you don't succeed, the rift happens, bad stuff. But I just went a different direction, where I was like, you succeed, you do it, and then you get tackled by all this energy and you gain super speed. And this seems like a good thing, but this person's mentor is like someone who's like, oh, you shouldn't rely on your powers. These things are really inflexible, or not. They always come and go. Bad things happen. And also this same hero had a very similar incident happen to them in the past. And so it like creates an interesting conflict and dynamic with their mentor with this kind of failure that seems on the surface level good, but actually is just like rife for interpersonal conflict now.
Yeah, totally. So yeah, you turned the good thing into a conflict thing. So it's kind of like a misdirect.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And also then another further failure, then the character lost their other superpower, and so they only had super speed, which is ironic how that session turned out.
And I'm last. I'm gonna do myself.
John, you seem also ready with an example.
Run
masks one thing.
Oh my god.
That's fine. But no, and again, I'm gonna fall back to Powered by the Apocalypse on this, because I think the thing the game does really well is it gives you impetus to fail, because there's so many fun things that come out of it, because the GM gets to make moves. And so I played a game of Urban Shadows on a stream, basically whatever the last season was for a lot of stream games on Twitch. And I was playing a character, and for about like three sessions in, like I'd kind of built a trope, and I didn't know where I wanted to go with it, and I still really wasn't feeling it. Then we hit an advancement, and I was like, ooh, I can pick a thing. And so I picked one of the options off of one of the things that basically turns you into an immortal construct. You were built by somebody, and so when you die, you instead break down, rebuild yourself up, and then regain in the scene. So I told the GM that we didn't tell the audience, like all the players in the game knew, but I got into a negotiation with the big bad, who basically jumped my town car and like popped the door open, went inside, and we had a little chat. And for like several dice rolls, we were negotiating back and forth, and I was doing fine. And on the exact final dice roll to try to convince them that I had what they wanted, I bombed it so hard. It negated all of the other successes I had at that point. And the GM is like, cool. They thank you for your time and then kill you. And everyone's like, what? And then but because of that, because we had the ability to do that, we meandered in, closed up, like we did that scene, closed that scene, did everyone else's scenes while the audience is like, what is happening, we don't get it, and then got to shoot to a scene of my character's like body pulling themselves back together after they had died. And that was a cool story beat, and it also it helped me as a player, because that the dice were leaned into what I wanted to happen, because I wanted them to die, so because I had an idea of where that character was going now. And sometimes when you failing like that can drive your story forward in a way that helps you really settle with a character and figure out who they are, because you finally like figure out who they are when the chips are down and everything sucks.
Yeah, for me, there's this freedom that comes along with playing a game when I know that failing is going to be fun, because I don't have to be like afraid of like, oh, are we all going to die if we get into a fight right now? Or are we going to have to make the perfect heist decisions so that we win and game the mechanics properly? You know, when you remove those problems kind of from the game and know that failing forward is in play, you can kind of do whatever you want and be able to kind of accept and roll with whatever the outcome is of your failures. I don't know. It's my favorite way to play. I love it.
For sure.
Cool. So those are some great examples. What is next? Oh, I think we started talking a little bit about games that illustrate failing forward well within the games themselves, like perhaps the mechanics that might exist. Like we talked about Powered by the Apocalypse a little bit. The obvious thing that carries through most Powered by the Apocalypse games is the idea of the success of the failure, the middling 7 to 9 roll, which, you know, in games when there aren't dice like Dream Askew, there's like still the 7 to 9 option of success with a failure. Success with a failure. Or success at a cost, sorry. So you succeed at a cost, which is basically what 7 to 9 is. On a 10, you win. On a 7 to 9, you get a success with a cost. And then, you know, 7 or below, you fail. So the actual dice mechanics and statistics of Powered by the Apocalypse games encourage the concept of failing forward without having to just kind of like apply it to the narrative of the game. Like those mechanics support that concept, which is awesome. It's like one of my favorite parts about it. There's other games that do this as well. I think Burning Wheel is another old example. Are y'all familiar with Burning Wheel?
I've heard of Burning Wheel, but I haven't gotten to play it yet.
Yeah,
I'll talk about Burning Wheel.
It's been at Games on Demand multiple times while I've been working at PAX. I just never have time.
Oh, cool, yeah. Burning Wheel was one of my first indie games I ever played of this generation, I guess. Where so the idea from Burning Wheel, which was one of the major games that kind of pushed this philosophy forward at the time, was that you know, before you roll dice, the GM will tell you what will happen if you succeed and what will happen if you fail, so that you know your expectations are set ahead of time before you even roll what's going to happen. So you have kind of like this idea of, cool, there's a fun outcome whichever way the dice land. So you're just kind of waiting to see which one it is. And that's kind of like when you set expectations ahead of the roll, that contract again between the GM and the player, where you're like, here's your safety net. Here's what's going to happen. Now you're prepared. Okay, let's do it. And then when it happens, you know, the failure happens and you all know what it will be, and you kind of expand upon it. And another mechanic that's built into Burning Wheel is that when you fail, you can try to roll any skill you don't have. And if you fail at the roll, you put a check mark next to it. And if you fail, I think 5 times, you get the first dot in the roll, a skill. So in order to learn the skill, you have to fail it at a certain amount of time. So it kind of incentivizes you to try and fail, kind of in the same way that, like, you know, as an artist, you're supposed to fail many times in order to succeed. It has that kind of creative work idea behind it, which is fabulous. It was pretty cool at the time. Burning Wheel is a very crunchy game. I love it. It's a very Tolkien-esque fantasy, if you like Tolkien-esque fantasy, with all its good parts and problematic issues. So that's another example of an older game that does that. An older game now that does that at the time. What games do you guys want to talk? Do y'all want to talk about as far as mechanically that support this concept?
Yeah. Do you mind if I jump in? So I think like what you're talking about with like setting stakes for rolls reminds me a lot of Blades in the Dark, especially. Where I think there's probably 2 elements like mechanically to talk about with Blades in the Dark. One is just the position and effect system, which is less important for this conversation, but it's important in the sense of, okay, let's negotiate what kind of possibility of of danger your character's in. So you're going to fail forward anyway, but is it going to be a costly failure, or is it going to be a less costly failure? Is this dangerous, and is there a way for you to mitigate that danger in some way? And then the second part of the negotiation, which is really interesting for this conversation, is devil's bargains, where basically a form of opt-in failure, where you can say, oh, I will let this thing happen to me and I will get an extra dice to potentially succeed on this roll. So it could be, oh, I'm trying to sneak into this party and trick one of the guests into giving me the key. And it's like, okay, here's a devil's bargain for you. What if your rival is also here and is also trying to do the same heist as you are? And what's great with a good devil's bargain is that person will just automatically grab the dice and is like, I want this to happen anyway. Give me the dice. And that's when you know you're doing something right with like these kind of costs and failures. And conception. And even if you can apply this type of thinking to other games in the sense of like try and engineer those type of failures and throw those into the narrative that get players excited, that would they want to like opt into this and like take that extra dice, even if it's like a totally different kind of situation to like get this failure, because then oh, the players are having fun here.
Cool.
So for me, this whole thing of games with building systems for, hey, failing is a good thing, and it may in fact be a thing that you do most of the time, is something that I'm new to. So I played I'm on like session 4 now of a Powered by the Apocalypse game. Things I did not know. So when we came in, it was kind of like, the background of games that I come from has, hey, you either succeed at the thing or you fail at the thing, and that's it. So when it was kind of, you succeed, but, and I'm like, wait. Or even, you fail, but, and it's like, do I need to kind of like reorganize this? Do I need to kind of plan this or map this out? And it was like a whole, hey, y'all, we're going to have a breakdown here. This is okay. It is okay for you to succeed with complications. That's going to happen most of the time. That's how it's designed. And it was my first time running into it. Since then, I've looked into that game, and Maskless was mentioned earlier, and some other things where it's kind of like, hey, failing is a thing that you're going to do. And that has been interesting. I didn't know how many of those existed.
That's cool. But it's cool to hear you coming into it as a like fairly new concept, and like experiencing it for the first time. Like that perspective is cool.
Because like normally, like the whole failing forward part is something that you kind of have to build into the narrative because the mechanics don't do it. So when you run into a game that puts that in the mechanics and it was like, hey, you should totally try this failing thing. It's good for you. It's like, okay. So let's see what happens. My most was, something, the failure is going to be fine when it occurs. And then I was playing a game where it's kind of like, well, because of the nature of the failure that you now have a particular type of what the game calls it is a kind of trauma that you get. Mine was, I now have a little bit, because I was doing all of these things anyway, trying to like jump in and help things against this giant plant monster. It was, you have a little bit less regard for your own personal safety than you should. Like that is the thing that I got. And of course, that was right after, with a sprained ankle and a small laceration on my forehead covered in Hello Kitty Band-Aids, I tried to jump in to save someone from a burning plant monster. It's kind of like, this makes sense, and I'm significantly less afraid of it and having more fun now with that whole idea. So there you go. It's been a lot of fun.
What kinds of games were you playing before you were introduced to this concept that didn't support it mechanically as much, you feel?
So Asterisk, Everything Finder, and also Dungeons and Dragons.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like then they had like Mutants and Masterminds too that we played, and then you also had. Well, I guess that was the other thing. The closest I'd come to this before this point was playing Vampire, right? Because you have these things where you rolled some successes and you rolled some pretty hard fails here in this combination of stuff you were supposed to roll. So this happens, but you do the absolute most. Like you successfully open the door, but it's because instead of gently turning the knob, you break the handle off and alert everyone to your presence when you're trying to be sneaky about it. That type of thing, which I'm like, that was cool and interesting, but I don't think it had the same, even Vampire didn't have the same feel as a system where the fear is kind of built into it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a little bit easier when you have the tools. Like if the structure of the game is actually doing the work for you instead of trying to creatively come up with it, like how to do that structure on your own. And I played White Wolf games for forever, like when I was a goth teenager and LARPs and everything. And I think, with horror games, it's kind of like an in-between, like Call of Cthulhu, Vampire, like I don't know, just off the top of my head as far as like horror, like you're kind of expecting the worst things to happen. Like part of the fun of a horror game is to make sad, horrific things happen. So I think there's part of like in the narrative, the framework of the horror narrative, like this idea like, oh, I'm going to fail horribly or something terrible is going to happen to my character. And that's going to be part of the fun. I'm going to lose my humanity, like whatever it is. I mean, that has its own issues, but I think with games, it's a little harder, when you're coming from games like D&D or Pathfinder or fantasy games, or even some old school sci-fi games, where it's kind of a hard line of like GM versus player, and it's kind of this not older, but more, I don't know how to say this really, but we think of it as trad, like a more traditional gaming style of like a competitive GM is trying to destroy you, players are trying to survive type of concept, instead of a more kind of fluid understanding between the two that I think games with the failing forward mechanics tend to have a little bit more of, the kind of give and take and the idea of like everyone kind of sharing the story and the narrative together.
I think that whole thing, like you were saying there, having everybody being able to share in it kind of makes the failing a bit easier to do when you're just like, hey, this is something that we're all contributing to, rather than it's kind of like, hey, I have made a roll and now the DM has just like given me like, here is the failure that you have ordered in a very dramatic fashion, right?
Yeah. I crush your dreams with with your failure.
Sorry.
Oh, is this personal? I'm sorry, I missed it. John, you had some games you wanted to bring up as well.
Did and real quickly for those, I want to go over the chat real quick for people who don't know. For PBTA, since we've talked about that kind of in passing and didn't really get into it too much, the failure mechanics for that are you gain experience and the things you use to gain new abilities every time you fail a dice roll. And also the way the GM moves work is you're mostly just telling a story, but when someone specifically fails, the rules explicitly say, do something GM-y here. Like, it isn't just, like, it's not just like, well, you failed, and next person, right? Like, it's, you actually are encouraged, and have to in the rules, do something with that failure to make it move. Which is a really great thing, I think, to talk about in that specific, for that kind of game. The two examples of things I really enjoy are Fiasco and Fate. Because in Fiasco, the people that make it out of games are the ones that succeed a lot, and the ones that fail a lot. Those two people do really, really well in the endings of a Fiasco game, and everyone who has like a nice mix of them ends out horrible. And so it encourages you, like, to, if you're going to fail, like, play to lose. Play to, like, dig into it, encourage the own downfall of your character, because you'll probably come out of it fine. Because you're not caught up. You are no longer as caught up in the nonsense everyone else is trying to do, because all of your plans are collapsing in front of you. In the Fate system, the way that works there is, okay, there's a concept called getting taken out. which is if you like lose a fight, and that fight can be, and if you're losing like a social conflict where you're trying to get something out of somebody, or you're losing combat, if that's what you're doing, you can choose instead to take something called taken out, and it is you concede, and like taken out is you lose and the GM gets to decide what happens to you. Prior to that, you can concede fights, and if you do that, you still lose, but you decide how you exit, and you gain a bunch of points for all of the damage or consequences that you took in the course of that setting to then throw at the GM the next time they try to do something to you. And so it lets you choose the agency of how you want to fail, and sets up failing as something that has stakes, that isn't just, well, this door is locked and will be continually locked until you with a lockpick for 20 minutes. If you've ever played a Skyrim game where you've broken every lockpick and you're trying to just break into this one stupid chest for 10 minutes and nobody cares and nothing's happening and it's fine, that's kind of what that looks like. It's not fun. Nobody wants to do it. You really wish the damn thing would just open, but you're stuck for 5 minutes just doing that instead. And both Fate and Fiasco incentivize failing because they make it mechanically relevant to how you play the rest of the game afterwards.
And Fiasco also utilizes like improv rules, right? Like the yes and yes but, and no but, which I know you had some feelings about before we started playing. Yep. Did you want to talk about the subtle differences between those?
Yeah, sure. So so we talk a lot about, like, the thing that people talk about a lot in improv when they take it over to role-playing games is yes and, which is like one rule. So yes and is very, very good at like encouraging people to start thinking about, like, here's an answer that you, like, if your initial reaction is to say no, don't do that, try this instead. And that's a great instinct to teach people how to get further into like a yes, into like a going with things mindset. The danger of only having yes and in your toolbox is that you start, okay, I'm about to do a really weeb reference here. You start with the opening of a trigger show and go all the way to the end of a trigger show. Like, you start with like, some dude's drilling in a thing, and then you start with giant robots battling aliens in space. Like, there's no, the escalation just goes from 0 to 100 if you just keep yes-anding constantly, which can be fun, and if that's what you're trying to do, cool. But yes, the other thing that we talk about is yes, but, which is you go, yes, but this is complicated and there's this new thing, and now we have to think about this new thing because that relates to this other thing because maybe they're not have to deal with it. But the other things you have to do is especially as a storyteller, think about no and no but, because sometimes it is okay to use those answers because failing to interfere in something means something to players. For example, the version I use is at the end of the Undeadwood show, which was like the CR affiliated Deadlands playthrough. Johnny sort of says, I want to stop this big character moment at the end of the show from happening, and Brian goes, no, just no, period, full stop. And it made sense in that moment because there are two characters having a really serious moment between the two of them that was really good and really dramatic and really good for that scene and good for the end of that show. But you need to know the difference between no, you can't, period, versus no, and this is the reason why, because that is a different type of, I don't think this is reasonable here, because of, as opposed to just, well, you didn't roll high enough, so you can't, which is a very different feel. Let that feeling for players, even though it is nuanced and slightly, and like on paper looks the same, is different in the moment of what is happening.
Also a bit of a player agency tool too. Like I know sometimes like a lot of people can suggest cool things to happen, you know, like, oh, your character could do this, or you could do this right now. And you're like, no, I want this to happen. Like, no, but this actually. so that you can kind of maintain control over your player's own or your character's own actions, which I think sometimes we have a tendency, like even as GMs, sometimes we have a tendency to be like, oh, Allison like slams their fist against the table and then goes to talk to this other character, and as Allison's player, I'd be like, well, actually, I don't think I want Allison to do that. Can I do it a different way? Those tools are like good negotiating tools too, I think, just in general.
For sure.
Morgan, you look like you're gonna say something.
Yeah, I just had one to add a little to the no and no but stuff too. And because they're also really good tools for as a GM, just when failure happens. Because sometimes if you frame failure in a certain way, it feels like a no answer, right? Especially if it's do I pick the lock? No. But if you augment that with an and or a but, you can like kind of roll into this failing forward thing again, right? So it can be, do I convince this person to join my side? No, but he will if you do this for him. Or it could be, no, and someone else is jumping in to get this person's allegiances now. What do you do? And that kind of thing can help like spur a story forward and create a lot of interest that way too.
Yeah, I feel like that Success at a Cost, that 7 and 9 roll from Powered by the Apocalypse games is just like yes and yes but, no and no but. Like basically a lot of the outcome, like if you design these games and you've written a lot of these Success at the Cost moves, move options, it's often like you do the thing, but also this thing happens. Like, you get to talk to the person, but they're upset at you, or you hit them, but then they get to hit you back, and they get to say where. And like, I think that those are the most interesting to me. I love those. I feel like I can't remember. Does anyone remember how that happens in the belonging outside belonging games? The 7 to 9 outcome.
Yeah. So how belonging outside belonging works is that the economy of the game runs around tokens, and so you gain tokens by doing what's called weak moves, and usually weak moves are usually negative things that happen to a character. So it could be, oh, I put myself in danger, I take a token, for example. Then there's moves that don't cost any tokens or gain you tokens, which are the Success at a Cost. So they're just normal moves, or I forget exactly the name. And so those are it could be something like, oh, you ward danger off, or you ward danger off by bringing the attention onto you, something like that. And then a strong move, you spend a token to accomplish something without a cost. So it'll be, oh, the danger goes away, and those are usually how they get scaled most of the time in belonging outside belonging. I'm not the biggest expert of them, but cool. I have played one once, so it's better than nothing.
Yeah, no, that sounds correct to me. It's been a long time since I've played. I love how that game system, belonging outside of belonging, that comes from Avery Alder's game Dream Askew, models the way to do this type of failing forward mechanically, this Success at a Cost mechanically, but doesn't actually use dice. Like you can, it kind of models the token give and take, like similar to fate tokens, right? Like, so you can actually have other mechanics in games that don't involve dice roll and support these concepts in your game. I think that those are good examples. Are there any other games we wanted to kind of highlight before we move on? I see Swords Without Master here as well.
Yeah, we could talk a little bit about Swords Without Master. I put it on the notes. Basically, the main thing I was going to say about Swords Without Master is that it's a little less interested in binary success failure. It's more about, oh, what's the tone of the scene? However, there is a way to fail in the game, which is just rolling 2d6 and getting double. And depending on what exactly the roll is, I think it's a 1, 2, or 3 double, you get what's called a mystery. And it's not just that, oh, you failed or had some sort of setback. It's, oh, you had a setback for either really mysterious reasons or supernatural intervention, which can just be, and it just happens, and it's either some way abstract or unexplainable, and that becomes a mystery your characters are trying to figure out, like, why did this happen, as like a way to just add new elements to the story that weren't there previously.
And that's cool for like if you're zeroing in on the specific, like Swords Without Master is what's it called? Sword and Sorcery?
Sorcery, yeah.
Yeah, and so it kind of zeroes into that genre of like how mysteries are included in the narrative and pulls that into the mechanics of the game, which is super cool.
Yeah.
Awesome. Cool. Thanks for explaining that.
No problem.
Okay, so we've already talked a lot about how mechanics shape failure in narrative, actually, but we have a few other things here. Conflict versus task resolution.
Yeah.
Did you? Did we already kind of hit on that? What did you mean by that?
Bit. So like this is like one of those like it's like one of those like weird specific like game design concepts that we could dig into a lot or a little. I'll try to just keep it more as an accessible level thing.
Yeah.
But basically conflict versus task resolution, it's not really a binary, but it's oftentimes written as one in like theory stuff. But anyway, really the important thing with conflict versus task resolution is just understanding the scope of what you're doing. And so a lot of systems frame the scope of a role as just, do you succeed or fail at this task? So do you pick the lock or do you not pick the lock? And success is you pick the lock, and failure is you don't pick the lock, and that's it. And conflict resolution is expanding the notion of what's at stake at a role to just the whole situation at large, the broader conflict that's at stake here. So it's not, oh, do I pick the lock? It's, oh, do I pick the lock before the guards check this room? Or do I pick it silently enough that I don't alert the people in the next room so we can sneak up on them or sneak past them? And so once you expand the scope of a conflict, it gives you a lot more ideas of what failure can look like while still advancing the story forward. So it's, and you can apply this to even games that don't inherently have it built in. So your trad games, even if they're built more toward a task oriented, there are lots of people who talk about here's how you implement conflict resolution and failing forward into those games, because it's not that difficult to port this kind of concept in. You just have to expand the scope of what a role means when you're like calling for them and setting stakes for them.
Yeah, I've only actually played 5e once, but apparently in 5e there is some of this is kind of set up as alternate rules, I think, for roles where it talks about kind of conflict resolution in this broader sense, but it isn't necessarily mirrored in the mechanics. It's just kind of like, you could do it this way. So yeah, I guess it does. It could kind of be in some of the text of these games already if you look.
Yeah, and there's like lots of like blogs and things if you Google it too that are like tips. So
since D&D is our overlord, it might be the most accessible example for some people.
Sorry, what? Sorry.
D&D is our overlord. D&D is the often it's the biggest example people would probably go to as far as role-playing games and looking for mechanics. Let's see. We also talk a bit about I see you wrote down here the Powered by the Apocalypse move snowball, which we didn't really talk about too much. But I know part of the Vincent Baker's earlier game, Dogs in the Vineyard, one of the things about stake setting in that was kind of building up, like making the stakes bigger and bigger and bigger. So if you get into a conflict with someone and you want the conflict to continue, you might start with fists, but then if you don't end the conflict after you have a fist fight, you then have to escalate it to knives, and then you then have to escalate it to guns. So it basically becomes more and more dangerous to be in a fight with somebody the longer you're in a fight. And that kind of sets up the expectations for what could happen if you fail. Like it starts low and then it slowly grows. And the move snowball is kind of similar to that concept in Powered by the Apocalypse, where one move can lead to another, and that can then make it so that you're kind of not rolling the same thing over and over again to see what will happen. You're rolling one thing, which will then lead to a different action, which will then lead to a different action.
So for those snowballing things, I feel like those are adjacent to one of the things I ran into in the Scum and Villainy game that I'm in, where you have a timer. So here's the thing, and also part of failing forward too. So this is also kind of cool because it's a tie-in. You have, hey, you wanted to do something. You managed to kind of barely convince the people that you're talking to that you have one particular thing you need to go into the building for, but they have to call their superiors or like talk to the HR department or talk to like, the Center for Security or what have you. So it's now like you have now initiated a conflict where you have 6 ticks of this pie or 12 ticks of this pie or whatever to go in and do the thing that you want to do. If you don't leave before that happens, there are going to be 12 people looking for you in the building. If you don't leave a certain amount of time after that, they will find you, and then you're going to have to fight all 12 of these people. I don't know if this is the thing that you want because they're very highly trained security personnel type of things. And I think that was probably that was the first time I had run into those. Then that's just like, oh, this is interesting. I haven't run into a thing where it's kind of like, hey, you have a timer. And you can see, like, exactly what the consequences are going to be when the timer runs out. It's not like you don't know it's coming. It's just, here it is.
I love timers in games. I think there's the cyberpunk heist game, Powered by the Apocalypse game by Hamish Cameron. I can't remember the name.
The Sprawl.
The Sprawl.
Yeah.
Has really good clocks. I mean, Blades in the Dark is actually very similar to the Sprawl. But at like conventions, Hamish would be like, okay, so you can plan your heist now. You have exactly 2 minutes in real time to plan it. And I think that's like effective. It's not just like the metaphor of the clock in the Apocalypse game of like, oh, the action, the bad guys are slowly getting closer to you, and they have, it's at 1 o'clock or at 2 o'clock or 3 o'clock threat of getting closer to you, if it goes all the way around the clock. But like literally you have 2 minutes. But I don't know. That's an interesting way to set stakes for players, is just to literally set a timer.
I think, speaking of timers, I realized there was another game I'm playing right now that has a really interesting success is failure mechanic that I want to touch on for a second. And that is, I'm playing the Expanse RPG with a bunch of people because I freaking love that show.
The Expanse is great.
It's great. And it has a specific mechanic called the churn. And the churn is, hey, I heard you were succeeding at doing stuff. It would be a shame if something were to happen to it.
Oh, no.
And basically, the more your players do, the more points on this thing go up. And the more points on this thing go up, the more things will suddenly dramatically go absolutely sideways. And it specifically does that really well because the Expanse as a property is all about a bunch of people succeeding at the thing they thought they were succeeding at, except, oops, that was not the thing you were doing, and now it's 8,000 other things. And for a media property and for a game which is trying to replicate the idea of even when you succeed, you fail, it does that really, really well. And that's another thing to think about, too, in terms of setting like the tone of your game, is that sometimes fail look like succeeding a lot right up until you don't horribly, and that's okay. And that's sort of like that's where your mechanics and what you have built up to talk about what failure is in your game will affect the way people approach succeeding. Because like when we're playing the Expanse, we know that the more we succeed at something, the worse this is gonna be for us in the long run, and that's really fun to think about.
Yeah, the failure becomes part of the fun of the game. And I think it's specifically super effective in genre emulation games, which most, who are we kidding? All of our games are genre emulation games, right? It's all sci-fi, fantasy, stuff. For the most part, we don't really play real games. Games set in the real world.
I run Westerns all the time. It's real bad. It's the thing I do. But there are certain genre conventions I need to think about when I'm designing there.
Yeah, totally. Yep. Totally. Yeah, Westerns are a genre. Historical fantasy is a genre. Yeah. So, and I think, so thinking about how that genre itself emulates failure and how the mechanics can represent that, like your Expanse game is a spectacular example of how it can mimic political sci-fi failure and the complications, create complications that would be similar to that genre. Let's see. I think we talked about incentives for failure, talking about fate points, right? Was there anything else you wanted to anyone else wanted to highlight with incentivizing failure?
Actually, there's one thing that a mechanic I ran into recently that's really interesting for this, actually. So it's a game called Teenagers with Attitude. It's a Powered by Epox game that kind of does your Power Rangers, your Captain Planet, that kind of thing. And in addition to, so a lot of Powered by Epox games have experience on failure. This game actually has a thing called attitude that you gain on failure as well, where it's, and you can spend attitude as just a currency to just boost results of rolls. So even if you fail, you get this currency you can spend later to succeed later on, which is like really also is like another interesting genre emulation thing where you start out failing a bunch and then towards the end, once you've accumulated the currency, you can spend it and succeed. And that's really interesting just because it allows you to just probably put yourself in bad situations. So you have the currency to spend it when you need it. And also you can gain the currency by stoking up drama between either you and other characters or between characters and things like that, which is why it's called attitude. And that's pretty fun.
That's cute and fun. I don't know why that reminded me of my game, A Cozy Den. But the main mechanic of failure in my game is that, you know, you're trying to make your den as cozy as possible. So like if you fail certain encounters, like if the internet is down and you're trying to make the den cozy in the winter and you can't manage to do it and you're just all grumpy that the internet is down, you lose a den coziness point. And so the den coziness point scale can kind of go up and down as you play. And, you know, yeah, you want it to be high, but if it's down, you know that it was not as cozy as it could have been. And so it's kind of like it kind of defines the atmosphere of the feeling of the game, as like a mechanic feedback loop, which I think is cool, like in what you're talking about too, like you know, as far as like that the atmosphere feeling, I guess. Yeah,
cool.
There is one thing I think I really want to touch on very, very quickly because it's not super the point of this panel. But I want to talk about putting it, like, when does failure matter? Because it's something we sort of touched on earlier where, you know, this is a thing that sort of not like very recently, but sort of has more recently become more of a game design sort of philosophy is, if you're doing things if you're making people roll for something where failing doesn't matter, then why are you doing it? And that's important because if you're going to make someone roll for something where they could fail and you don't have anything ready for when they fail, then the roll you did was just sort of buying time until they got to the thing that you wanted them to do anyways. And that isn't a great design point. But again, like we said, there are a lot of games. I'm thinking, insert section finder, D&D, 13th Age, things like that, are all sort of games based around that same sort of combat grindy simulator where you're all swinging swords at a big bad and trying to, take it down. And there are ways to mitigate that mechanically. If let's say, throw it all out the window, you don't want your players to fail. Well, then you have to design something that will help them not do that, because otherwise they're just going to fail for no reason. 13th Age does this with the escalation die, for example. That if they're insisting on fighting and they're failing, every round that goes up, they'll add more and more bonuses to your players to hit the thing that they are trying to hit, so that the first couple rounds can go badly, but as you ramp up into it, everyone gets tired and things start to slow down, and then you really start to land the hits that you want to. And that's really good for a game that wants you to succeed at combat, because that is kind of the core loop of the game. But that's the kind of thing that we talk about when we say you have to be really intentional about what is the reason why people are rolling dice and what do you want to come out of it. Because if you want people to succeed, you should design for them to succeed. And if you don't have, and more importantly, if you don't have a thing for their failure, don't make the failure an option. If you sit there and go, well, I don't know what to do with it now.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And I think a lot of the times in systems that don't kind of mechanically support the concept of interesting failure, GMs or players might not know what to do, and so they might call for a roll. They might be like, I feel like there needs to be a conflict here, but I'm not sure, what it might need to be or what the outcome of it should be. So let's roll, to see what happens. Which is not a bad instinct, but sometimes then the outcome is kind of binary or maybe not as interesting as it could have been with a little bit more mechanical support.
I think in some cases too, where at least for some of the games that I've played, the mechanics for, I'm going to put this in quotes here because I don't even know if this is a term or what the term is called, where you just have like passive success. Hey, your character and the way that their stats are distributed is kind of like, if you're a dexterous character, right? Like doing like feats of, like athleticism or climbing things or, like nimbly making your way through things is just so normal and average that you don't even need to roll to do these. I had, in my case, because one of the first games I played was, of course, Dungeons and Dragons, I know, but I was playing that for like 2 years and some change before I found out that they had just passive mechanics where it's kind of like, hey, it's this thing plus 10. So because on average, these things just work. And it's a very interesting thing for me when they talk about, or when you're like reading the rules and things, it's like roll for this or roll for this or roll for this. And it takes you until page 265 of reading all of this before they finally get to the point of, or you don't have to roll. And here are a whole bunch of things. If you don't want to have to roll things all the time because the rolls don't matter, you can just do these things. And so having games that put that in the front of those kind of gives you that idea of, did we make these games so that, like you could like better determine when failure matters or when those things are important, and you put them up front with everything else versus putting them in the way back corner over there to hope somebody finds it at some point someday. It's a very different thing, and I've become a little bit more sensitive to that over the years for looking for, what do these mechanics tell me that you want me to do more often? And if you don't want me to roll dice often, please tell me that in like the first 20 pages of the book instead of in the last 2 pages of the book.
Yeah, I think also like when you talk about play cultures in game communities, like what are you pointing to, John? Oh, you're muted.
I was pointing to all of you saying these things because I agree wholeheartedly.
Oh, okay. I thought you were pointing at your knives or something, maybe. I was like, are you gonna knife fight me? What is happening?
I will knife fight people who put rules at the backs of their games, but yes.
Burn.
Listen, it's...
yes. I've totally forgot. Oh, play cultures. I think that it's really interesting because we often think that tabletop role-playing games is just one play culture and we all do it this way. There's like this assumption kind of. And play cultures are radically different depending on like where you live, what games you play, how old you are, what, potentially identity groups you might be in, what country you live in. So, and like game rules are widely interpretable and, infamously don't always do the best at guiding play. And even now that we have stream games, like I think people look a lot to game streams online for how to play a game, right? Like, oh, here's kind of how I can play this. Even streams will play the same game differently. So I think it even helps to have like that, like even if like in a Powered by the Apocalypse World game that emulates these rules mechanically, it is good also just to have a conversation with people ahead of time about, how to do this stuff. Even if it says it in the game and is in the mechanics, I think that there's kind of like this baked in feeling of we're playing a game, you either win or you lose. And just kind of expanding that concept is good just by having that conversation ahead of time, which maybe leads me into our next topic, which is how to implement this at your table. So like, how would you have these conversations with people, or like how do you have conversations with people ahead of time before you play or during the game about how to implement failing forward?
Well, for me, I think the easiest way to go is just to be straightforward about it and kind of go, okay, so, right, we're not going to succeed at things. We need to talk about how those things are going to look or how those things are going to work. And I think part of this is just like DM honesty when you're talking about these things. If we're playing in a game that requires me to do some level of footwork on what the consequences are going to look like, it's a if I ask you for a role or this is the conflict going on, when failure happens, this is what I'm going to do. I think having that and setting those expectations up front lets people know, okay, well, this is cool, this isn't cool, and it lets you kind of collaborate on things where for a lot of, or at least in my experience, a lot of it just kind of happens behind a black box. There's failure happening and there are consequences issued, but I don't know where that's coming from or why, because I don't have the visibility that the DM does to where things are going and how my character fits into those things or what the overall narrative of that the whole thing is. And so, oh, well, I mean, that's right there, but we'll get to that later.
Oh.
Well, it's right where? Oh, yeah.
Does someone else want to have any ideas about how they've done it before, or like have implemented these rules?
Yeah, I'm just like figuring out the exact words for it. Oh, okay, now I got it. So like the really important thing is so I'm just gonna start with the perspective of GM first, just because it's easier. But a lot of it is a combination of being honest up front and like, oh, this is the thing I'm going to do ahead of time, and like this is sort of the tone of the game, so we know like the sort of spectrum of failure that's on the table. Like, oh, is death on the table? Is this kind of thing on the table? And having those like boundaries established can help know what failure is okay for people to experience and the kinds that they want to. And then, while implementing the game, like sort of like not implementing, playing the game and running it, there's like two good things, especially early on, to help people get into the swing of failing forward. And I think the first is establish stakes before roll. So just tell people, if you succeed, this happens. If you fail, this happens. Partial success will look like this. And just them knowing ahead of time means that they can let them push back against you. Like tell them, like, I don't know if that's interesting. Could it be this instead? And like be willing to change this. But also, it's a lot less rough to experience failure when you have that sort of expectation of what it's going to be when you're rolling. And so especially early on, it can help people adjust. And then also just like modeling like like that kind of stuff, just being like excited for the player's success and failure, and being invested in their stories and making sure to support them even when they're failing can just be a great way to just make everything more comfortable and smooth at a table too.
Totally. Yeah. Like just kind of creating trust. Like, yeah, exactly. Like you can trust me as the GM to not surprise you or turn things around on you in a way you weren't expecting. And here's what that will look like. And I will emulate that constantly. And yeah, and if you have a different idea, let me know. Yeah, John, did you have any more thoughts about this? I'm also seeing a lot of LARP conversation in the
odd
chat here.
Odd sidetrack that's happened.
Yeah,
but I don't have a lot to add. I think that hasn't necessarily been covered already. But I do think the thing I want to really emphasize is, the thing at sort of the heart of it that we've been talking about is like the goal is to learn to trust the people at the table with you, because if you trust them to be able to run the story that you're trying to tell, if you trust them to run the game that you are playing in, you can avoid a lot of the pitfalls of feeling like your failure doesn't mean anything, because you know, even if it does, something interesting will come of it. And that will really wildly depend on how personally you are invested in your player's failure. And I've seen the most fun I've ever had at a time is when, like, I'm playing. I run a lot of convention games, I run a lot of organized play, and somebody will like step up who has never played a game before, or they're like, especially because we run a lot of D&D, will step up. They've never played D&D before. They've maybe watched some D&D. They've seen it play. They show up. They've got their brand new shiny set of dice. They've got the character sheet that they put together. They sit down. They roll the table, and they just suck. Like, their dice hate them. Their dice would rather leap off the table and leave than continue to play the game with them. And it's just low roll after low roll after low roll. There is nothing quite as like that moment when someone rolls a natural 1 and you get to say, okay, so this goes badly. And also badly. And then they're just like, oh no. And they're too busy worrying about the new bad things that have happened to be mad at the fact that their dice rolled a 1. And the goal, I find that often for me, the goal is to distract people from the fact that they have failed. Because what's failing is really just, well, okay, you failed, cool. But now something is going to happen, so deal with this. Now something's going to happen, so deal with that. No one, like, I'm going to go to, like, hacking as a genre of movies. No one hacks a thing and doesn't hack it. They hack it, and they get caught. They hack it, they leave a trace. Or they hack the wrong thing, and it's a thing, and then because now people are breaking into their house to go arrest them or whatever. There are always consequences for success, and there's always consequences for failure. And we think a lot about what happens in the first one, and not as much as the one that happens in the latter. And that is honestly the most important part, because success by itself can be a success, and you feel good about it. But no one just feels good about, yes, you didn't hit, next character. Because that's just, like, you don't want to feel like your time at a table is being wasted.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, that's hard to convert sometimes. How to make people feel better about failing in a game that doesn't give you too much of a good feeling about fail, like that doesn't kind of recontextualize that failure. Or even some of these games that do recontextualize the failure, people are still seeing it's like, oh no, I didn't pass the roll. I didn't get a good roll. I got a bad roll. It does feel like you are trapped a little bit in a binary there. I love your example of how you recontextualize it there to help people feel. What are some other good techniques to help people feel better about failure in these types of situations?
So I've found that mostly in general, a lot of the things that I deal with in terms of playing games is a lot of people who come to play to, like, so stepping out of like just a regular gaming into like a therapeutic gaming standpoint for a second, because that's like what I'm academically qualified to talk about, apparently.
Yeah, totally. This is
when
really
did that happen? Who put me in charge of stuff? So what happened is so a lot of people who come to play a lot of tabletop games, and the way we use them therapeutically is to deal with a lot of very specific things. We deal with a lot of social skills, and we deal with a lot of frustration tolerance. That social skill ones you can do a lot by just playing the game and making people aware of the like the consequences and actions of the characters. But frustration tolerance we try to do to teach people that, you know, just because you fail at something doesn't mean that's the end of it. And that means that games where failing is the end of it, we have to rewrite constantly. So again, failure leading to you fail, but something interesting happens because of it, or you succeed, but it's more complicated than you thought. Are often really good ways to do that, because they specifically frame it as, okay, it's not just a yes or no, it's a convoluted situation, and what you're getting is a snapshot in time of the moment of you doing something in the situation. And sort of refocus it to, like, you know, as opposed to just a litany of the things that you have failed, is that here is a broader arc of something that you aren't only now really seeing. And failing sometimes means you get a glimpse of that broader arc. Even if you fail at the thing that you are personally trying to do, you'll see something bigger behind it that you're then encouraged to chase and to figure out what's going on. And that's like, and we were talking sort of about this about, like, you know, noir movies and like pulp detective stories. A lot of those things are people just failing constantly, and like getting down on their luck and losing out until they finally like bumble through enough things to see the bigger picture because they've experienced all these other people succeeding around them and they know where their goals are headed. And that's a really super important thing to think about, because you can tell an entire story where someone fails 17 dice rolls in a row and succeeds on that last one, but you need to get them through those 17 dice rolls to that 18th one that is worth it.
Yeah, totally. I mean, it seems like the answer to this is just reframe it into being success at a cost.
Like, yeah, or success or failure, but it's a failure in something, a failure that reveals something, right? Because like you can, like, success at a cost has a very sort of like, well, you do the thing you wanted to do, but it's complicated. And there is, I think, there is also value. But it's trickier to do. You fail at the thing you wanted to do, but you learned something else.
Yes, that's true.
Like if you go in. Oh, sorry.
So you called it failure with a complication, or
something? Failure with complication, or failing forward.
Oh
sorry. So one of the things I really do enjoy, right, is like the moment. There's a moment in, I don't remember what series it is, but there is a moment where they like. It was like a heist story, and everyone shows up, and they've been practicing to go through this heist forever, and then they show up. And they realize it was like an urban fantasy series, and they show up and they realize that the safe that this person had been practicing on to break into was not even remotely the safe that's been installed in the space where they were trying to do. And everyone goes, "Oh no, everything we've planned for is awful." And then they learned two things. One, that because of the way it was designed, because in that world, magic and technology don't really mix. Because it was designed a certain way, there are magical defenses that will cause it to go off. And because of that, they realize, oh, wait a minute, that person is aware we have a wizard. Oh, we need to think about that now. And those moments of failure let you create bits and pieces that will tease other things out if they're trying to investigate, will find for them. And that's kind of, I think, one of my favorite things to do is to say, yeah, this is not going the way you want it to, but that's important because it'll tell you something about the thing that you want it to happen and why it's not doing that.
And I think in a lot of ways, what John is mentioning is probably like almost makes failure more important than success, because we're framing this as in, hey, right, there is the world that you're in like this, and the part that you are in right now is like this big. Imagine succeeding in that scenario and getting that out and not knowing what your enemy knows because you didn't fail. Like, that's really cool. That's really cool. And I love seeing things like that in games.
Yeah.
Yeah. Also some like other like practical like at the table stuff for individual characters in the situations is when failure happens, like a couple good ways to do it is making the failure really personal to the character that's happening to in certain ways. So ways that either incorporate, say, backstory elements. So say, oh, I'm like fighting this person, like, and they're in armor. I don't know who they are. At first you think it's a random goon. And they're like, oh, why did I lose this sword fight? Reveal, like, pulls mask off. Oh, it's my rival from my backstory. No wonder I lost, or something like that, right? I mean, like, when those like if like someone's using like those failures as moments to pay off things that like the character like established there, or the player established they're already interested in, that can be like still really rewarding, even if the dice result was a failure, right? Because you're just like, oh, you listen to the things that I like put out there, and you're using this as an opportunity to include them in the story. Or you can also use it as like failure as a way to like escalate tension in a story, make things more dramatic. And it's not necessarily, oh, I lost something, but oh no, the stakes are higher. Oh, the situation's more tense. Oh, now something I really wanted is like involved in this, and I now have real things to lose. And that makes the story more exciting, even and more dramatic. But like, it doesn't take away from the character, right? It just puts like your personal elements into the game, and then you become more invested in the situation because of it.
Yeah. On a practical level, one thing we forgot to mention was like in Powered by the Apocalypse games, there's GM moves. So like when someone rolls a failure, the GM then makes a move off of a list, which is like take things away from them, or they're somewhere that they don't want to be, or something much worse suddenly shows up, or like, and you kind of can, I mean, like anyone can read what the GM moves are. You can kind of know in advance what those are and like what kind of trouble you're getting into. So it's like, oh, if I fail, I know I'm gonna, a bigger monster is gonna suddenly appear, or I'm gonna turn a corner and run into my ex-girlfriend in the high school halls that I don't want to see, you know. So I think, yeah, along those lines, like good practical tools. Cool. Anything else before we move on to questions? Oh, John, you're gonna say something.
There is one other thing I want to talk about real quick.
Yeah.
And so we spent a lot of time saying, like, you know, don't make people roll for no reason. That being said, there is a really fun trick you can do, and if you tell people, like, so this requires a couple things. One, your players need to trust you, so work on that first. Two, you need to be extremely intentional with when you as a GM, specifically for GMs, call for dice rolls, because the greatest thing about it is one, my personal rule for it is, if I call for a dice roll and you fail it, none of the other players get to go, well, can I roll? I'm like, no, because none of you know what's happening. You would have no reason to know that I'm doing this. And they go, oh, you're right. I'm like, I know. Continue. It'll be fine. Don't worry. And what you do is you can use dice rolls, especially if people fail consistently, to build a sense of tension and anxiety in your players, because they, as players, know that they're missing something, and their characters are blissfully ignorant of any danger about to land on their heads. So, a quick example of this specific thing I'm talking about. When a bunch of my players we're playing in a fantasy pirate campaign right at the moment. A bunch of my players go into a tavern. Cool. One of the things I do in my off time is run a stream doing fantasy shanties and rewriting traditional like sea shanties for fantasy world, so you don't have to talk about England in the Forgotten Realms for some reason. So when we do that, we take and rewrite them. And one of the things I rewrote one of the first projects I did for this was a rewrite of that mentions and name drops a big bad in the character's backstory, who is a fairly important person in the world that they live in. And because one of my friends and I have no breaks, we recorded it. They did all 5 parts. We had a song version of that where I threw it through a low pass filter to make it sound like it was coming through another room, and just started playing it in the background very quietly so that nobody would notice. And so we're sitting there, and I'm letting the song play, I'm letting it go, and every now and then it's be like, hey, roll me a quick perception check. And they're like, fail. I'm like, don't worry about it, you're fine.
And what do you mean?
What do you mean don't worry about it? I'm like, well, you didn't hear it, so your character has no idea. Just keep playing. We'll get to it. And I would just do that every couple minutes. And then when they finally succeeded on the roll, dropped the low pass filter, turned the volume up so they could hear it, and the sea shanty name drops the person in their backstory, and they go, and they started a bar brawl over the fact that this happened. And that's a fun way to do it. If you can play using failure, if your players know that when you are having them fail at something, they trust you to bring it up and to continue to no, we will get to it, I promise, don't worry. But your character's failing at it, and I specifically play a lot from a director sort of standpoint versus an actor standpoint for me. I love the actor standpoint a lot, and it's something I really enjoy. It has the most trappings of playing like a solo player in a game designed for people. But what I like to do is get them to think about the story that is happening, because then the players are super oh god, what is happening? Something is happening. We're in a tavern. Nothing's happening. Nothing is going on. What's going on? And it's just something as simple as there's a shanty in the background you didn't notice that name drops the person you hate. It wasn't anything evil. It wasn't super evil. It wasn't there was death coming for you now. It was just someone singing about that person you don't like. You should pay attention to that. because it told stuff about like what they've been up to recently. And so that's the kind of thing that where you can use failing forward to drive your players into knowing that something is going to happen here, and to set up the expectation that something bad is about to happen so that they are perfectly aware of it when it inevitably entrance music to a boss fight before the boss shows up is my favorite example of this. Music starts playing, there are no save points, the room is empty, something's about to go down, and you're failing to spot what it is. You don't know what it is. And that's fun. Like, that kind of like ratcheting tension can be super useful if you use it well.
Yeah, it's like a meta technique.
Yeah.
It's a GM move to the players.
Like,
yep. It
is that Jason? Wait, how do you know? Well.
Yep.
Oh my god. Yeah, music is an insidious tool in gaming. If you've never used music, can be fun to use intentionally. If I use it in my game, Something Is Wrong Here. There's different songs that you play in different parts of the game that evoke a different mood and are disturbing.
Very.
Let's move on to questions since we're almost done here.
Oh wow.
I know. We were like, we're not going to talk for 2 hours, and here we are.
We thought.
Yeah, totally. It just goes. It just keeps going. And
speaking of failing forward, our expectations wrong.
We have failed forward.
We have.
So here's the first question. This is a panel that focuses on role-playing games. What are ways that other styles of games can learn from failing forward? And do you have any ideas for examples of implementation? This question is inspired by a game that they played that they weren't sure if it was a board game or a role-playing game. And one player ended up having nothing to do because of failure. So it's like the kind of, I failed, now I have to wait here for a long time because I failed type of situation. I think that I can give examples of 2 other types of games where I've seen this implemented well. In LARP, in Nordic LARP, there's a concept of playing to lose, which I just kind of adapted towards all my gaming, which is just very similar to, it's kind of like a LARP version of failing forward, where basically you're not playing with any kind of aim in mind in the game, in the LARP, other than to have fun and to help other people have fun. And so part of that, the playing to lose aspect, is that you're playing to create more drama. That losing, your character going in a losing or tragic arc might create more drama that could create more fun for everyone around you. And if everyone is doing that with that in mind, then it kind of erases the idea of one person winning the game because you're all playing to lose. Another example is I recently played the Dune board game, which is bananas if you've ever played it, but it emulates the Dune factions and politics really well. So you can play any of the Dune factions in the books, and you have rounds, and each round you kind of plot and plot and plot as much as you possibly can as factions, and then at the end there's like one move that happens, like you pull a card or you roll a die, I can't remember what it was, and literally anything could happen. Like all of your plans could fall apart. Most of the time they probably will, because one faction could randomly succeed from a dust storm, or one faction could randomly succeed because they get a windfall of money. And so it basically emulates the idea that you're probably going to lose all this politicking that you're doing, but it's going to be fun in the journey along the way. So that was a board game I recently played that emulated failing forward.
As simple as an example as this is, my favorite thing for games where I fail at them is Cuphead. Like things we didn't expect to be here today. But so you're playing this game, and especially the boss battles in particular are my favorite in these, because you're fighting this thing, it's just like, it has no health bar. Okay, so you're fighting the boss, it doesn't have a health bar, and it usually has like a couple of phases or whatever. But then I got into this one fight. It was particularly frustrating because you're trying to dodge stuff and it's throwing moves at you, And then like, like I finally lost like the last health point and I died. And what they present you is this racing line with a dot for each phase, and like here's where you start and here's where you end. Now I expected 3 or 4 failures in to be super salty because like I'm trying to do the thing but I'm not doing the thing. But then they just tell you, well, here's about how close you got. So you're getting something right if you're getting further than you were the last time. And just putting in this random, hey, here's a bit, here's an indicator of the progress you're making, took all of the frustration out of failing and just took that same amount of frustration I would have had and put that energy into, let me think about how I got to this point in this line and maybe figure out how to get a little bit further. So it went from a quarter of the line to 3/4 of the line, and I'm like, aha, it's these 2 weapons, or it's this particular idea, or maybe I need to use these superpowers. And that was the first game I had played like that, where they implemented here's how we're gonna handle you failing at this, because you fail a lot in that game that way. It was super cool.
I want to say that I'm not sure where or what exactly the mechanics we're talking about, but if we're talking board games and stuff, a lot of very few board games handle the kind of balancing even if you are losing, you are still in the game. They have a lot of board games have a very capitalist design where when you're winning, and when you're losing, you're just losing. And I would like to posit an example of a game that does this really well. It's a video game that does it, and really and often kind of gives you that kind of wonderful spite motivator when you are in last place, to really buckle up and sort of affect the game. I would like to present the blue shell from Mario Kart. It is quite possibly the most iconic "fuck you" person in first place item, and in terms of game mechanics in video games I can think of off the top of my head. And because of that, it is one of those things that even if you are in the game, even if you are ahead, you never quite feel like you're going to just win. I never quite feel like you're going to just succeed. If you're failing, there is an absolute opportunity for you, if not to succeed completely, but to make everyone else's day feel that little bit worse. Which makes you feel a lot better. The teeny little bit of it. The spite shell is, again, spite is a wonderful motivator. It's not a good, reason, but it's a great motivator. But yes, there's a lot of really good ways to, do that kind of design if you are really focusing about how, when you want people to get back into the game, even if they're losing.
Morgan, did you have any examples you could think of, or we can move on to the next question?
I mean, I'll just hit one real quick, because a lot of things with Failing Forward is a lot of other genres are grappling with it in their own ways, and it's and a lot of it's just seeing what they're doing. So in video games, you can just look at say a game like Dwarf Fortress, where there's really no metric of success. It's just you're playing to see what happens, and whatever happens and whatever disaster happens to you is fun just because interesting things are happening in every moment, and the game's systemically designed to just keep making things happen. Or I haven't played Crusader Kings, but I think it also does a similar type of deal where just it's making things always it's more about interesting things happening rather than success or failure, and making a game about that it's just really fun, because even when you're having a rough time, practically speaking, you're enjoying yourself because you're oh, this wild political twist I never saw coming. Fun.
Yeah, that makes me think of a lot of narrative video games I've played, like the Walking Dead video game, where, you have to make a choice, I'm going to give this person or this person food. And say you give John some food and you don't give Brad food, and then it just says at the top of the screen, Brad will remember this. And that's that's the outcome. And there's no other effect to that. It's just it makes you feel bad. and it's narratively fun to feel the tension of the interpersonal conflicts in a zombie story, right? And so that's kind of like their version of Failing Forward. I also play this game called Wander Song, which is spectacular if you've never played it.
Oh my god, yes. It's so
yeah. You sing. But it has boss fights ostensibly, but every boss fight that you have at the end of each level, you lose. Like, you just lose them. You don't win. And the story kind of continues on as a story about your failures and how failures can be good for growth. And it's just a really clever take on boss fights in a video game. So I think there's ways some video games are deconstructing those things.
And there's also, I want to bring this up because I've been playing 2 games by, I think, Mimi Games, and they are Shadow Tactics and Desperados 3, which are real-time strategy games that just came out. And what they do, at least in the video game thing, is they encourage save scumming. Like, you are incentivized to save all the time, and when you mess up, you are incentivized to say, nope, rewind! And because of that, you learn the patterns of the games, and you learn like what you messed up the first time, and you learn to be more aware because you're remembering the things that tripped you up before. And because of that, you're learning how to be better at the game, because the game inactively says, no, failing is okay. We expect you to mess up. Here's a bunch of tools to mitigate the fact that you are failing so that you can learn from it, which is super important.
Yeah, that's fun. Yes, that's fun. I like that. Let's do 1 or 2 more questions because we've got 15 minutes. Let's see. I feel like we talked about how to help players coming from systems like D&D. We kind of talked about how we feel about player knowledge versus character knowledge in terms of backstories and how that motivates character reactions to failure. Is there anything else we wanted to say about that specifically, though? Like, kind of like the player versus character dynamic when it comes to motivating the character reaction to failure?
Well, I mean, I think the backstories at the very least tell you as a baseline, if this is what they decided to bring into the game, then this is the stuff that they care about. So if you're going to give them or like talk about failures and how to move forward through the narrative and bring them along, it's kind of like, well, I gave you a cheat sheet. Here's a list of all the stuff I care about. Please use this, right? It's it's the back when I was the person who would be like, well, here's that 5-page Google Doc you requested about why my person decided to be like a bear paladin, or like a thief who's also a gardener, or like the retired military person who decided to be a traveling bard. Like, I told you that I care about things of what my character wants and aspires to do. Please do not ignore these things and then just go, well, here's a story that I wanted to tell, and that time that you spent telling me what you care about doesn't matter anymore.
Yes, absolutely. Like, a character sheet is kind of like a map. It's like a gift that the player is giving to the GM to tell them how the GM can like frame stories around them. Morgan, you looked like you were about to say something. No.
Come back to me. I'm thinking for a second.
When I'm playing, I know for me, when I'm playing, I'll play lose. So, I'll play towards those weaknesses in my backstory, or be like, oh, I just failed. Here you go, GM. Would you like it to be this failure? Just kind of to help with how to best tell my character's story, or how I would prefer, I guess, the character's story be told. As far as like the agency behind like what my failure could look like. And sometimes it's not, sometimes that's not what the GM had in mind, and that's also fine. But I think that can be helpful to kind of have in mind in a meta level as you're playing, just like what your characters like, oh yeah, maybe we forgot that my character had this relationship, but let's bring that up here, or, things like that.
I think too, one of the things that we're getting at too is bring your players into it. Right, like give them some responsibility and some agency to be responsible for the things that their characters do. Because if you I am the kind of player who will absolutely be like, oh, I rolled garbage. Hey, can I fail this way? And like that's the kind of thing that I will absolutely do. And I think having that as a GM for people to be like, wait, can we fail this way? um I go, oh, you're really like that's super useful for me because I'm like, cool, I didn't have anything for that because I'm that kind of GM. I was gonna have to think of something for it. Thank you. Yes, I will happily take this is mine now. Thank you very much. But it gives you the opportunity for them to tell the stories they want to tell that they want to tell, because if like they're offering how they fail to you, they're invested in their own story, and it takes so much of the responsibility off of you to have to kind of like push people along to what they're doing, that it like if you treat it as a collaborative experience because of that, it works so much better, I think, anyways.
And I think alongside that note is like, as a as a GM, like especially if you're like, if this is something that you can like learn and take with you early on, then please do, which is like bring everybody along and let them contribute to like the world, like make room for them in this story. They're playing along with you and not necessarily in opposition, and ultimately not ever in opposition. It's just a, hey, here we are, just like 6 players or 5 players or 4 players doing different parts of making this one story that we're trying to make.
Yes, totally. The GM is a player too. Yeah, and you know, you might not have written like like, you know, when I played Vampire, we would write like 10-page backstories, and like it was ridiculous. You know, it was more like a creative writing exercise than a role-playing game a lot of the time.
Mine was 5. I feel
yeah. Yeah. That's just like something, you know, and there's no right or wrong to do this, but even in games that don't have like those long backstories or even established backstories, like even if you're playing characters to find out what happens or to find more about their backstories in play, there's other things you can put into conflict, like their relationships, their bonds, you know, their particular skills, their NPCs, you like whatever could, you know, is on that character sheet kind of counts in this situation.
Yeah, and I think I've got the thought together, I hope. So it's like, I think there are 2 things that you can also do. Like, one is, even if especially if like this will happen with like people who are new, they don't always know exactly how to communicate the thing to you. But if you look at their backstories and just see the conflicts inherent in their backstories, like, oh, they describe like, oh, here's this tragic thing that happened, or this person I want revenge on, or I am Inigo Montoya, prepare to die, and like they bring that kind of like energy in a character. Like, you can like see those things and be like, oh, okay, here, let's drop this in, and let's drop this in. Oh, here's the person that remember that thing you were telling me about just last session? Well, here it is. Or here's a little breadcrumb to lead you there. And then the second thing, power of leading questions. Leading questions are great. And sometimes it could just be, if you don't know, like ahead of time, like like you're just trying to play to discover the backstory, you can just say, someone rolls a failure, and you just say, so who is the person you'd least want to show up in this situation? And you might not know the answer, but you can just let the player feed you that answer.
Yeah, asking questions is great. That's another thing. It's another rule in Powered by the Apocalypse games, where, you know, as the GM, if you're not sure what could happen, defer to your players and ask them what should happen next. And, you know, sometimes it's great ideas, and then you're all collaboratively storytelling. Cool. Let's see. We have like 7 more minutes. Is there a game you're excited to play that hasn't been mentioned here, that kind of features these failing forward mechanics, or any kind of concepts of failing forward? I am personally excited to play Bolipian. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing it right, but it's like a
Fine, yeah.
what's that? Oh, I'm sorry. Okay.
There's some.
That's okay. It's a cyberpunk. Oh wow, what is the culture that it features? I'm
Filipino, I think, right?
Filipino. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's Filipino mythology cyberpunk game. And it is Dream Askew kind of mechanics. And it kind of, I think cyberpunk is one of my favorite genres for emulating failure, because it's pseudo noir in that you're playing kind of characters that are failing a lot and are under deep oppressions politically, but also from the corpse. And this game looks fantastic. If you haven't heard of it, definitely check it out. Anybody else?
Yeah. Speaking of Filipino games, there's one that I want to play called Karandun, which basically the premise is that it's really hard. I don't know how the best way to explain this quickly. But basically, you live in this really fantastical Filipino-inspired mythology, broader universe, I guess is the way to put it. God's dead, the world is ending. You now have to kill all the other gods and like assert or just sort of like make your mark on the world before it all ends. The tagline in the game is "Make God bleed." So if that's your thing, you probably already know just from that.
That sounds amazing. I also want to play that.
It's and as far as Failing Forward goes, it's PBTA adjacent in the sense of it's very deeply inspired by it, but it doesn't use moves in the traditional way. It has like basically you look at the mechanics, you're like, these are effectively moves, but the dice mechanics are very different and are pretty recognizable based on how they work, but just like put an interesting twist and are not the same old 2d6 again.
Cool. Anybody else?
Literally, I just want to play all of them at this point. There are so many. There are so many. Although I think the one that I have been thinking about, I would like to learn a little bit more about this because I don't know things, but I've heard good things about it, is Burning Wheel. Although I've heard that there are those kind of, are y'all sure y'all wanted to do that? Parts of Burning Wheel. It's overall an interesting, kind of interesting and fun game to play, and I would like to try that out. Mm-hmm. Yeah, listen, well, I mean, I guess Werewolf. We're playing all the games.
Play all the games all the time. Lose your life. Play games forever. God, I'd get nothing done. I think one of the things I'm looking forward to is Gun and Slinger, which is a 2-player game about playing. It's like you and your sentient weapon wandering through the apocalypse, trying to figure out who they are, where they come from, and what the stories are there. One of the cool mechanics is a lot of the things depend on you and your both players, as both the slinger and the gun, having to match their intentions and matching the way they play, because if they don't, the gun doesn't shoot because the slinger was like, I want to shoot. The gun's like, I don't want to shoot. And then you've got to go figure out what the hell that means for your relationship. And that's a super neat narrative thing that I really enjoy because I again, massive weeb, Soul Eater, Bleach, all those things are things that I enjoyed a lot. And so I really like those kind of things for 2-player intimate motivational games. And all of the mechanics are if you fail, well, what does that mean for who you think the other is? Which is super cool.
Yeah, it's cool to see all these 2-player experimental games happening.
I love tiny, intimate games.
They're really good. I agree. Okay, so that's about it. Thank you so much, all of you, for this amazing panel. We talked the 2 hours, go us. We failed forward. If you want to find us on social media, I'm on Twitter at Kiranansi. It's Kiranansi. John, where can people find you?
You can find me on Twitter at Ryamasa, RY0MASA, on Twitter primarily.
Cool. Sin?
You can find me also on Twitter at Synxiec Beta or here on Twitch.
And Morgan?
You can find me at nestedgames.itch.io, or you can find me on Twitter at magpie_mirror. And also, shoutouts to whoever gifted me a Twitch sub to Huetopia. I missed it because I wasn't looking at the chat at the time, but thank you so much.
Oh, yay. Yeah, thanks for all the subs. And I guess that's everything. Thank you so much, all of you. This was a great combo.
Well, thanks for having me here.
All right.
fun.
Who are we rating?
Oh, I don't know.
Oh, okay.
Well,
Hold
we
on.
have someone.
Good
Good
people
sh-
of B Dave.
Is-
They are
Yeah.
talking about things and doing vampire things.
Yeah. So Hunters
Hunters
Entertainment.
Entertainment,
Looks like
there we
B-Dave
go.
is running some vampires, so we're gonna. Ooh, yeah, we're gonna pop on over there and raid them. Very excited for this.
Cool.